Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Michael Lestrange. I'm the Director of the National Security College, and I'd like to warmly welcome all of you to this, our second in the public seminar series for the College. At the outset, I'd like to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and whose cultures are among the oldest continuous cultures in human history. I'd particularly like to welcome this evening the Attorney-General and thank him very much for the time that he's given us. The first Minister to grace one of the seminar series, although the former Prime Minister launched the College back in May. And we're delighted to have you with us this evening, and I'm particularly delighted that the Attorney will be focusing on the issue of community resilience and national security, an agenda for the future. This is a critically important area of focus for us, not only because it addresses the widening issue of the concept of national security, but also because it addresses the capacity of Australian society to prepare effectively for, to respond to, and to rebound from emergency and even catastrophic situations which may affect local communities or particular economic sectors or the nation as a whole. So it's a very important topic, and there's no one better than the Attorney-General to do this. He brings real authority to our deliberations on this issue, and again I'm delighted that he's with us. The Attorney, Robert McClelland, has been a Member of Parliament for the Sydney seat of Barton since 1996. He's a graduate of law at an undergraduate level from the University of New South Wales and from a postgraduate sense from the University of Sydney. And as a fellow Sydney-sider, I would say that's a pretty good two-way bet. But it's tremendous to have you here. The Attorney became a Shadow Minister very soon after he was elected to Parliament in 1998, and thereafter served in a succession of Shadow Ministries, including the Attorney-General, Homeland Security, Defence and Foreign Affairs, all of which I think have prepared him tremendously well for the issue that we're addressing this evening. And of course, since November 2007, he's been the Attorney-General of the Commonwealth of Australia. So it gives me great pleasure, Attorney, to welcome you this evening, to thank you very much for coming, and I'd like to invite you to address us.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. May I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we meet on and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. I've just come from a cabinet meeting, so I can tell you that the election date is going to be, well, in fact I can't, it wasn't decided. It was the Prime Minister's call, so we're still all wondering. But it's certainly my pleasure to be here today to address the National Security College, although only recently established, again by the former Prime Minister when he announced it one Saturday a few months ago, I recall. The college, under the leadership and guidance of Professor Michael Lestrange, as he now is already establishing itself as a centre for leadership in the National Security Committee. As well as developing excellence, the centre will be a vital pivot in the creation of networks within and outside government, and this concept of relationships will be the focus of my presentation. As Michael indicated, my topic for discussion is community resilience and national security, an agenda for the future. The National Security Statement of December 2008 reflected, we believe, a maturation of our national security policy. The statement acknowledged the government's responsibility to protect the safety and security of Australians from all forms of hazards, not simply from the threat of violence from state and non-state actors. Our all hazards approach recognises that the safety and security of Australians and our economic and social well-being is more than just the threat of war or terrorism. It also encompasses natural disaster, strong borders, and combating serious and organised crime. And just to underline some of those risks, it's worth noting that since European settlement, official records indicate that over 6,000 people have died in Australia as a result of natural disasters, And of course, the Victorian bushfires, sadly of February last year, reminded us of that ever-present risk. Further, just a decade ago, it was inconceivable that disruption of the internet could cause economic and social upheaval. Yet today, our reliance on electronic communication is such that a serious assault to our cybersecurity could have devastating consequences. There is potential, obviously, for serious dislocation of services provided by our utilities, by our government, as well as social and economic infrastructure more generally. Indeed, the maturing of our approach to national security has meant that our capability has shifted from simply responding to identifiable threat to shifted from building simply a response to identifiable threats to one of building a resilient community. Resilience is an expression that is increasingly used in public policy in terms of the economic context, in terms of building resilience to financial instability, such as the recent global financial crisis, and it's obviously also used in the national security context. The goal of resilience in both cases is essentially the same. It is reducing the likelihood of being impacted by a crisis, and if we are affected, reducing the consequence of that impact. And this means building capabilities, as Michael said, to resist, to respond to, and also to bounce back from any disaster that may confront our nation, whether it be man-made or from natural events. As a nation, we are appropriately devoting considerable resources to our national security. This year alone, for instance, the whole of government national security contribution at a federal level will be in the order of $4.2 billion. And then, of course, you have to add to that the contributions of state law enforcement agencies as well as emergency response agencies. But the reality is, irrespective of what resources we apply and despite the dedication of our emergency response agencies, while it is, if we get our call right on each and every occasion, possible to prevent a terrorist attack in Australia, it is literally quite impossible to prevent a natural disaster. Therefore, to be effective, our national security strategy needs to be flexible and adaptable. If we're going to build a resilient community, it must necessarily be community-based. Building a resilient community essentially means building relationships and forming partnerships. And I'll discuss that in the context of several topics: countering violent extremism, boosting critical infrastructure resilience, developing long-term emergency management capability, and also fighting organised crime and cyber security. Firstly, dealing with that first issue of countering violent extremism, the Counter-Terrorism White Paper, which was released earlier this year, developed 4 strategies that you're probably familiar with. Firstly, analysis, and that is an intelligence-led response to terrorism driven by a properly connected and properly informed national security community. Secondly, the concept of protection, and that was taking all necessary and practical action to protect Australia and Australians from terrorism at home or abroad. Third was a concept of response, providing an immediate and targeted response to specific terrorist threats and terrorist attacks should they occur. And the fourth concept was the one I'll be focusing on, that concept of resilience, building a strong and resilient Australian community to resist the development of any form of violent extremism and terrorism on the home front. And in that context, it's instructive to note that since 2001, 38 people have been charged with terrorism-related offences in Australia. 37 of the 38 people who have been charged are Australian citizens, and indeed 21 of the 38 were born in Australia. It's important, however, that we put those figures in context. The number of people attracted to terrorist ideology is in fact only very small, and indeed those who would actually go on to commit violent acts is smaller still. Nevertheless, their potential for harm is vastly disproportionate to their number. The saying that our law enforcement and intelligence agencies need to get their strategies right on each and every occasion, and those who would commit violent acts have to succeed on only one opportunistic occasion is unfortunately very, very true. By its nature, terrorism seeks to spread fear and uncertainty, and success of the terrorist is therefore measured not just in terms of a body count, although that is often their goal, but in the seeds of discord that are inevitably sown and the impact on attitudes, policies and economies. For these reasons, the government is actively pursuing a strategy aimed at countering violent extremism in our community. And indeed, I think we'll agree that if we want our children and grandchildren to live in a country, or indeed a world where the threat of terrorism is a distant memory, we need to continue to focus on countering violent extremism in this day and age. In developing this strategy, we've looked obviously at programs overseas, and we've also looked at valuable programs that are being undertaken at a state and territory level. This work has shown the effective strategies are not about targeting specific ideologies or beliefs. At a broader level, they're about promoting a community that is tolerant and inclusive, and we have a head start, I think, on many countries in that context. But at a specific level, and ultimately that's where the strategy is directed, the strategies need to focus on communities and individuals who are most at risk. For example, the government is conscious that prisons can potentially provide an atmosphere which supports disengagement and the adoption of a violent extremist point of view. Accordingly, we're actively working with the states and territories to develop initiatives geared towards the de-radicalisation of individuals within the correctional system. Working with respected community leaders is an important part of this project. Indeed, that is becoming a live issue because 3 persons who have been convicted of terrorist-related offences are now in the community on bail. The internet is also increasingly used by extremists to communicate their messages of hate and destruction, and we're aware of that. For example, Al-Qaeda's great success since 2001 has been its exploitation of the internet to effectively establish franchises of like-minded groups or individuals around the world. The process of radicalisation, encouraged by sophisticated extremist propaganda, much of which is produced by a dedicated Al-Qaeda media arm, now only requires a computer terminal and an internet connection for it to influence an individual or indeed group. The government's made it clear that the internet is therefore a key area to be addressed as part of our violent extremism strategy. We're collaborating with our partners overseas to consider the unique challenges posed by online extremism in an effort to counter the propaganda of the violent extremist view. And again, all the research shows that it's important for the community itself to have this role. It's preferable that any argument countering that of hate and violence be advanced by the community itself rather than by just the government. Community mentoring is also very important, and indeed in that context last week I met with a number of community representatives in Sydney to discuss how we can better work at a local level to achieve our objectives. Understandably, of course, there was a range of views, some strongly held. But significantly, there was a clear appreciation that a terrorist event in Australia, as I've mentioned, would cause not only injury, death and destruction, but it could also severely damage the overwhelmingly tolerant and inclusive nature of our society. Indeed, my electorate of Barden is between Cronulla and Maroubra, where the riots occurred, and I think substantially racially motivated, quite obviously. And I think a terrorist event in Australia would see those nasty strains re-emerge into our community. And indeed, I think that was appreciated by the group. The view was expressed that the communities that would suffer most from a breakdown in our culture of tolerance and respect would be the communities from which the perpetrators of any terrorist attack originated. As such, the consensus was that working in partnership to counter violent extremism was a worthwhile endeavour. But there was 3 clear messages that were apparent. First, ongoing and genuine engagement is important. The view was expressed that engagement was more effective if it wasn't forced, and specifically if it wasn't merely in response to an event once it occurred. Second, the community pointed out that a lot of good work is already done by the communities themselves, and as a consequence it was suggested that more work should be undertaken to identify those programs that are being effective and to map them against areas of need and vulnerability. And finally, in developing the government's response, it was suggested that there is a need for government and agencies to recognise that there is no such thing as the Muslim community in Australia, but that it is a culturally, ethnically and ideologically diverse community. And as such, while engagement at a broader level is worthwhile, it was stressed that there was a need to engage both at a group and individual level, and effective engagement with young people was understandably stressed as a priority. These were all worthwhile and constructive suggestions, and while that feedback, together with our studies of overseas and local experience, is tremendously valuable in development of our strategies in Australia, again, I'd welcome any research and any feedback that can be undertaken and provided by the National Security College in respect to that, and indeed all these issues that I'll be discussing tonight. The second topic that I was going to discuss was that of critical infrastructure resilience. By definition, critical infrastructure is that. It is vital to an effective functioning economy and society. Damage or disruption obviously has serious consequences, irrespective of how it was caused. The Counter-Terrorism White Paper identified critical infrastructure protection as a crucial area, given that around 90% of our critical infrastructure is privately owned. And again, the all hazards approach to national security is directly relevant. I was pleased recently to launch the government's Critical Infrastructure Resilience Strategy, which encourages traditional risk management and business continuity practices while also embracing organisational and community resilience initiatives. The strategy aims to achieve the continued provision of essential services that support Australia's national security, economic prosperity and social well-being in the face of all hazards. And this means developing a capability to prepare for, prevent, to respond to and recover from both foreseeable and unforeseen events, be they a terrorist event or a natural disaster. A key imperative of the strategy is to have effective business-government partnerships with critical infrastructure owners and operators. And in that context, the Trusted Information Sharing Network for Critical Infrastructure Resilience is one avenue for engagement in this partnership. Adopting a military analogy, there is, we believe, little point in developing expertise to fight the last war. We have to develop our capabilities to deal with the unpredictable. Capability is required to develop management structures and skill sets that enable an organisation to continue to function as best it can during a crisis and to recover quickly and effectively from that crisis. The strategy involves devolving management responsibility and empowering lower level managers and employees to exercise judgment and respond to challenges in a way that enhances an organisation's resilience. And in that context, the best example given to me was that of a sporting team where the coach can set out the game plan and develop skills, but in terms of judging the events on the field, it has to be necessarily delegated to the teams, the professionals on the sporting teams, who exercise judgment in the context of the events that unfold during the game. And that similar analogy was provided in terms of the concept of developing resilient organisations. I think, however, this is an area where Australia is leading the world. The cooperation that we've received from private industry in developing the TISNs, or the Trusted Information Sharing Networks, is truly outstanding. It's enabled, for instance, the Attorney General's Department, in conjunction with Geoscience Australia, to develop the Critical Infrastructure Protection Modelling and Analysis Capability, or CIPMA, which assists organisations and agencies to project the consequences of a range of possible emergencies. That program has been developed as a result of the provision of confidential information, a vast amount of confidential information by businesses to enable the government to develop the mapping technologies. But again, despite these encouraging initiatives, we're still really at a relatively developmental stage in assessing what structures and practices are required to create a resilient organisation. And again, this is another area where the National Security College can provide valuable input. The third topic I was going to refer to was the important topic of emergency management. I think it's fair to say that since the September 11 attacks on New York and Washington, there has been considerable advances in developing our national security structures to deal with the threat of terrorism. There's been a tendency, however, not to apply the same rigour to the crucial area of emergency management. In emergency management, unquestionably, we still have quite some work to do, but we're working hard with the states and territories to build architecture that is equally as effective as it has been for national security. We have, for instance, formed the National Emergency Management Committee that advises the Council of Australian Governments on emergency management, and we've also developed the National Catastrophic Natural Disaster Plan to develop a mode of operating in the event that a state or territory suffers a natural disaster that overwhelms their capacity to cope. We've also developed cross-agency plans in the areas of climate change and bushfire arson. But underlying each of those plans is the concept of building community resilience through community engagement. This is absolutely essential, as evidence suggests that the impact of climate and demographic changes are actually increasing our exposure to disasters. For example, housing and infrastructure is increasingly being developed in areas that are environmentally desirable, such as on riverbanks and indeed overlooking gorges for the view of the natural bushland, but these settings are often extremely vulnerable to natural disasters. Extreme weather events are becoming more frequent, and indeed it's estimated that in the past 30 years, disasters have cost the community at least $1 billion in current dollar terms. And indeed, while the bills are yet to come in from the last calendar year, the experience of the Victorian bushfires and the massive floods that affected 60% of Queensland, we're looking at the Commonwealth Bill being in excess of $600 million alone, let alone what the states will contribute, it being on a knock-for-knock basis that we essentially pay for that reconstruction effort. So this is an indication of the amount that the community will suffer if we don't continue to work at building a resilient community. As part of that resilience, we're developing a number of programs specifically called the Disaster Resilience Program. That includes projects like tsunami modelling and emergency management volunteer training, and the program also supports local resilience projects such as flood levies, bushfire trails and emergency management volunteer organisations. But building a resilient community necessarily involves developing a change in attitude at all levels of government and the community. The time has come, we believe, to take a hard look, for instance, at the planning processes in Australia. There are clearly some areas that are unsuitable for residential or commercial development. I think that will be the subject of commentary by the report of the Victorian Royal Commission, and indeed more generally common sense suggests that it's not tenable, for example, to build a nursing home or a school on a floodplain or in areas that are consistently exposed to bushfires. Also, we're aware that individuals can play an important part in minimising the loss to themselves and their community. Clearly, having proper evacuation plans before an event can save their lives and the lives of emergency responders. Equally, building homes that have a greater chance of withstanding disaster risks, be it flood, cyclone or fire, are also obvious examples. The government is talking with state and local governments about these matters, but there is still much work to be done. And indeed, the insurance industry has over the years amassed a considerable amount of data so that they can also play an important role in engaging in this dialogue. And again, on all these issues, your input would be most welcome. The fourth topic that I am talking about is in the context of organised crime. Organised crime is estimated to cost the Australian community in the order of $15 billion a year. Much of that goes offshore. It's taken out of the Australian economy. Internationally, the links between organised crime and terrorism are well established, and recent evidence indicates that organised criminals have both financed and undertaken people smuggling activities. The presence of organised crime can significantly distort markets, driving legitimate industry out of business, and indeed organised crime notoriously targets governments and government agencies, or at least identified individuals in those agencies, and that in itself can be a threat to the stability of those agencies, and indeed in some countries potentially a threat to the stability of the country. For these reasons, organised crime is unquestionably an issue of national security, and this was recognised at a meeting that I attended recently of Attorneys General from Canada, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, the United States, and obviously ourselves. We all agreed on a declaration that will mean greater sharing of information and criminal intelligence, as well as improving coordination in shaping international policies and initiatives and enhancing cooperation between law enforcement agencies. So in that sense, the community that is contributing to building resilience of each of our communities is the international community. And that interaction complements the suite of measures we've adopted to more effectively prevent, investigate and prosecute organised crime. Earlier in the year, the government passed significant reforms aimed at removing the profitability of criminal activity and also increasing the likelihood of being caught. So removing the motivation for becoming involved in criminal activity and increasing the risk of becoming so involved. The measures included strengthening criminal asset confiscation and anti-money laundering regimes, requiring individuals suspected of possessing unexplained wealth to demonstrate it was legally acquired. Indeed, the onus shifts to them if a reasonable suspicion is presented to the court, and broadening access to telecommunications interception for the investigation of organised crime offences, which have also been broadened to include being a member of or supporting an organised crime organisation. In addition, just this morning, with Brendan O'Connor, the Minister for Home Affairs, we launched the new Criminal Intelligence Fusion Centre within the Australian Crime Commission. The centre brings together the Australian Crime Commission, obviously, the Australian Federal Police, the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, our border protection agencies, including Immigration and Customs, as well as the financial regulators, AUSTRAC, and state and territory law enforcement agencies. That centre will provide in-depth criminal intelligence analysis by identifying high-risk cash flows, patterns of crime and individuals, businesses and corporate structures that may be involved in criminal enterprises in Australia and overseas. And while the government has and will continue to provide leadership through the provision of appropriate powers and resources, again, community involvement remains essential. Successfully disrupting organised crime often depends upon information provided by individuals, whether through direct reporting to police, through Crime Stoppers, or through the National Security Hotline. For instance, in April of this year, there was a nationwide effort to help protect customers and to encourage merchants to take extra security precautions with their EFTPOS terminals to combat activities of a large and sophisticated international organised crime network responsible for credit and debit card skimming. Indeed, we probably all know, if we haven't been a victim, of someone who has been the subject of credit card skimming. The effort involved the Australian Bankers Association, the Australian Crime Commission and the Australian Retailers Association, working alongside a national law enforcement task force, and again, without that input from the private sector, there is no doubt that the task force would not have had the success that they have. That's not to say the risk of skimming is one that is continuing. And indeed, the Minister for Home Affairs and I have discussed developing formal links between the Criminal Intelligence Fusion Centre and business, much along the lines of the trusted information sharing networks that I've referred to in the area of critical infrastructure protection. And the final but very significant area that I was going to talk about in terms of the importance of building these community relationships to have resilience against the threat is the internet. It's a classic example of an evolving national security threat. As a law student 30 years ago, I didn't even use a computer. Yet today, they're now obviously linked with almost every facet of our lives. And because of this, new vulnerabilities have been created by a vast matrix of electronic connectivity that links everything from personal computers to power stations. And this connectivity facilitates potential reach of electronic hands deep into Australian systems, where they can extract sensitive information, be it from individuals, from business, or indeed from our security agencies. Computers and the internet are so pervasive that we're now confronted by the reality that cyber intrusions are a real and insidious threat to our nation's security and indeed economy. Given this rapid change, it's a safe assumption that the cyber environment will continue to evolve exponentially as it has in the past few years. It will continue to do so in the future. And acknowledging this, together with the reality that neither the government nor the community owns or controls the internet, it's critical that we build our combined resilience to cybersecurity threats now and as they are likely to emerge into the future. Again, in that context, last year, the government launched an overarching cybersecurity strategy which outlined a vision for a secure and resilient cyber environment, and in terms of achieving that vision, the role of the community, of everyday users, again individuals and businesses, in protecting themselves is paramount. Security vulnerability on the internet is a classic example of the weakest link, because the failure of an individual or a business to protect their computer can result in the entire system becoming vulnerable. So while the government is equipping the community with advice and information necessary to protect themselves, the ultimate responsibility is for individuals to act on that advice. And we're continually working to enhance the accessibility and relevance of the advice that is provided by government. The Computer Emergency Response Team, or CERT Australia, will be the central source of cybersecurity information for the Australian community and a key point of contact for Australia's international cybersecurity counterparts. CERT Australia formally commenced operations in January of this year and will continue to build its capabilities throughout the remainder of this year. CERT Australia also works closely with the newly established Cybersecurity Operations Centre within the Defence Signals Directorate of the Department of Defence. Essentially, CERT Australia will be the go-between between information received by the community and the expertise that exists in that multi-agency centre. But given the very nature of the internet, international efforts are also crucial. So again, the community expands to the international community. The internet makes it easy, obviously, for those who would seek to exploit vulnerabilities, particularly in those countries with poor regulation, to base themselves in those countries. So the need for a shared international approach is the motivation behind the government's intention to accede to the Council of Europe Convention on Cybercrime. The government of the United States, directly through the Attorney General, made representations of the importance of Australia becoming a party to that convention. The convention, which entered force in July of 2004, is the only binding international treaty on cybercrime and aims to establish a fast and effective regime for international cooperation in responding to cyber threats, be they online fraud and the use of the internet or the use of the internet to sexually exploit children. Importantly, the Convention serves as both a guide to nations developing comprehensive national legislation on cybercrime and also as a framework for international cooperation between our signatory countries. And all of those countries, again, were grappling with the issue of how we provide a one-stop point of contact for members of the community and businesses to report internet exploitation or abuse so that this information can be centralised and fused with other information to identify the extent of those risks. So again, both locking into the local community, locking in then to our agencies and then to the international community is an example of the extent of collaboration and cooperation that we require to deal with these threats. So in conclusion, each of these threats that I've touched upon demonstrates the breadth of the national security threats that confront us. These threats are evolving and are often intertwined and indeed more often international in their connections. Australia's security intelligence and law enforcement agencies have developed considerable expertise in their capability and cooperative systems to protect our security. However, the more that knowledge is acquired of national security risks, the more it is appreciated that the community itself plays a crucial role in developing an ability to withstand threats of all types and magnitudes. And in that context, it's probably the topic for another discussion, our democratic system and our values, I think, gives us a head start again in building those relationships. As I've said, an effective national security strategy requires clear understanding of the individual and community roles and responsibilities that we all share. Governments, through their agencies, have a fundamental responsibility to protect the safety and security of their citizens, both in Australia and overseas, but increasingly a crucial part of our national security response must be building those relationships and forming partnerships with private industry and with individual citizens. We all have a responsibility to contribute to our own safety and the safety of one another, be they members of our immediate community or the Australian community more broadly. In the area of countering violent extremism, for example, members of the community are ultimately better placed to identify problems and engage with disaffected individuals within their own communities. And by its very nature, the concept of resilience requires community action. A community that is able to confront extremism, serious and organised crime, or the effects of natural disaster will reduce the very opportunities for those threats to develop and ultimately, should they develop, to minimise the potential impact that they have on those communities and indeed the Australian community. And that's why building resilience through community engagement is so tremendously important to our long-term approach to national security. And I'd like to thank the College for the opportunity to speak today. The College clearly has an important contribution to make on this topic, and indeed over time you'll build up your own contacts and alumni to keep those partnerships operating. The government certainly looks forward to working with you to further enhance both government and community capability to make our country as safe and secure as it possibly can be in a rapidly changing and increasingly complex national security environment. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Attorney, for that very comprehensive survey of the challenges that confront Australia in this area, the initiatives that the government's pursuing, and the role of engagement by the wider community in those challenges. The Attorney's very kindly made available about 15 minutes for questions, and in order to get through as many questions as we can in that limited time, could I ask people to keep their questions focused and short, and in that way we can get as broad a range of views as we can. So the floor is open in terms of questions to the Attorney. Go start there and then at the back.
How do you see national security concerns entering into the population growth debate? By that, I mean, should we be encouraging the development of regional cities rather than cramming everyone into Sydney and Melbourne, where they become even more critical nodes, population-wise and infrastructure-wise?
A national security aspect hasn't attached to the development of that population debate, but I think what you say makes a lot of sense, and perhaps it should be examined in that context. I mean, I can think of reasons why overcrowding and forcing suburbs onto the outer fringes of cities and in those more risky interfaces could be minimised by a decentralisation policy. I think, quite frankly, the point you make is a valid one. Not certainly within my department, work hasn't been done on the topic, but I think the mere fact that you've raised it is a sensible suggestion that perhaps it should be looked at. Thanks.
Yes?
Yep. How effective do you feel the proposed and now postponed ISP filtering system is in?
Yeah. The filtering system would have had the ability to have removed not non-classified, rated in terms of the by the census material, which could have included offensive sites such as those portraying beheadings or sites promoting or encouraging violence or inciting violence. So it could have had a role there. Pardon me. Equally, however, there are legal mechanisms in place where the ACMA, the Australian Communications Media Authority, has authority to take down sites that actually promote violence. So there are some laws in place. It would have been an additional mechanism that could have operated, but I think the framework's there, and we'll just have to make sure that we use that framework and use it as diligently as we can.
The independent national security legislation monitor bill was passed some months ago. However, to date, no one has been appointed to that position.
Yeah.
Can you please provide further details as to the reason for the delay, when a number of bodies, both government and non-government, have expressed the need for monitor to be appointed? Firstly, could you please advise as to when the monitor will be appointed?
Yeah, the monitor will be appointed by the Special Minister of State, who's responsible to Prime Minister and Cabinet. That decision was deliberately made because much of the monitor's work will be reviewing legislation that I or the Attorney General's Department advance. So it's a call for the Special Minister of State. Having said that, I know that originally John Faulkner, but more recently Joseph Ludwig, have explored several persons who they think would be suitable for the role, and I understand that some discussions have taken place. It is probably, however, the case that a person won't be appointed to that role during the caretaker period, but I know that there have been discussions between the ministers, plural, and certain individuals.
Attorney General, thank you very much for the presentation. I'm interested in your views about human security. Although the concepts of relationships, community, resilience and partnerships have been part of your talk, much of the focus of policy still seems to be on structures and processes, especially emergency management, organised crime, infrastructure. So although these are really important topics, I was wondering about your views about the ability of human security, human life and Australian values to be placed at the centre of the debates to inform national security policy making.
Yeah, I suppose in my last concluding words where I suggested that having a democratic society gives us an advantage in building these community links to build a community resilience, and saying that's probably a topic in itself. It was along those lines that I alluded to. I'm strongly of the view, and in that sense the motto of my department is building a fair and secure society, because the two concepts go hand in hand. If you have a fair society, you are less likely to have people who are disengaged from it, who are disgruntled by it, less likely to engage in antisocial events, including violent extremism. it's being a little romantic to say that you're going to eradicate that possibility, but I think less likely. Again, if communities, however, feel that they are part of the broader community, they are more likely to respond and interact with law enforcement and intelligence agencies. And I should say in that context, we're doing pretty well in Australia. The law enforcement agencies and the security agencies will tell you in, I think, just about each and every case of the successful prosecutions that we've had in Australia. And it's an issue that's not promoted in the media, but virtually in each and every case, vital information has come from the communities themselves. So I think having an inclusive, working on building an inclusive society, building on one that respects the rights of others and respects fundamental rights and freedoms and feel that they have a voice, even access to justice concepts where they feel they've got an outlet for a grievance, all helps to build a community which is less likely to foster extremism and more likely to build cooperation. I'm not telling any tales out of school because it's open source, that a lot of the counter-radicalisation work that is done, including in our region, by the CIA is about fostering respect for human rights in communities that are likely to be radicalised. So that's open source, it's not intelligence, but it's also common sense. So again, I think that's a debate, well, not a debate, I think it's a topic that it justifies its own discussion. I think it makes sense.
Attorney General, sorry to introduce the question of elections when, as far as we know, no date has been set, but I'm wondering if you can tell us what would be that you would do, or your successor, if you change portfolios, if the government was returned, so what it is that is necessary, why on this national security level the government should be returned, what remains to be done, and what big announcements you might make.
Yeah, I'm not sure in terms of big announcements, but look, I think if you go through each of those topics, what needs to be done, and it was a subject of Rick Smith's comment going through those issues, cybersecurity, I think we need to centralise the point of contact or of a cyber guardian where people, whether it's a parent in a household is concerned about someone online or they have fraud, can report to a central point of contact that then liaises with others and gathers information. I think in the organised crime area, more work needs to be done on getting our confiscation of assets regime in place and accessing the unexplained wealth provisions. We need to bed that down. The links of that fusion centre to the private industry, I think we need to bed down. Again, in emergency management, there is more work to be done to redouble our efforts to get the same serious focus of attention that the traditional concept of counter-terrorism has received. Get that happening at a state, federal and territory level. I think in that context, the Victorian Royal Commission has been particularly instructive for all of our organisations. And certainly in this area of counter-terrorism, the work, and we've put $9.5 million into counter-radicalisation, which is not a large amount, it builds on other projects. So we're really just putting our foot into the water of countering violent extremism rather than counter-radicalisation. And more work needs to be done. I mean, I've only personally had one community meeting in that space, and I'm firmly of the view that if we want to see the threat of terrorism being past tense, that we need to do much more work in that space.
You've mentioned many legitimate national security threats, but at the opposite end of the spectrum, what about the danger of capitalising from fear, in particular politicians who would like to, for instance, the new debate about asylum seekers. Julia Gillard has opened the floor to people to vent their fears without framing them in politically correct terms, and this seems to be capitalising on fear. Isn't this the other danger from over-propounding like the national security threats which face us?
The It relates a little bit to the human security point again. The counterproductive nature of, certainly if a community sense that a government is exploiting national security for self-serving reasons, they are clearly going to be more likely to be alienated from the government of the day, arguably the community of the day. And I think it's very, very important that any government that comes to power does not, and specifically is not seen to be, exploiting national security for self-advantage. I would like to think, and I'd like to think it's accepted, that myself, Stephen Smith, John Faulkner, and others having a national security role have specifically moved away from a previous style of communicating in this area. In addition, we have undertaken, in conjunction with the Victorian Government, the Victorian Premier's Department, a Lexicon of language program, which is a public service name for looking at what language is actually inflammatory and counterproductive when we're explaining and communicating with national security issues. So some draft work has been done in preparing the response of that research, but that's something that the government will be releasing in the near future. And indeed, I think it's very important that we engage not only with the government as to how these expressions are used, but also with the media as to how they approach these issues. Inevitably, when this sort of thing is raised, there will be some commentators saying that, well, you're not calling it as it is, you're not calling a spade a spade. We recognise that argument, but quite clearly, on all the research here and overseas, the use of language can actually be counterproductive rather than constructive to dealing and minimising the potential of a terrorist threat. So you point at some validity there.
Time for one or two more. Is there anybody else that would like to?
Done pretty well. No worries. Thank you.
One more? Hang on. Just one last one.
You didn't talk about contingency plans at all. Say, for example, there was this flood, 40 days, 40 nights of rain, and it was a big flood. What do we do?
Yeah. Well, the catastrophic disaster plan looks at that issue specifically in terms of the events in one or multiple states that would actually overwhelm the government of that state or territory. And indeed, it was quite controversial because no state or territory wanted to exceed that, recognise that could happen, but there are plans in place, for instance, for another state to provide the services to back up those which would be taken out in a state. There was some controversy about the background to that catastrophic disaster plan being released to the media because the scenarios that it looked at were, it was concerned, could cause anxiety in the public. But these various scenarios have been looked at and are part of that plan. And I think it's healthy that that information is out there. Thanks.
I think I'll save the Minister's voice. There's nothing worse than a politician losing his voice. But look, on behalf of everybody, particularly the National Security College, can I thank the Attorney for the depth and the range of his remarks this evening on this important issue. To my mind, the biggest single change that's affected national security policy over the past decade has been that as a result of globalisation and the information technology revolution that's driven it, and as a result of the new agenda of transnational issues, the old demarcations between domestic policy and foreign policy and many aspects of defence policy have broken down. And this is particularly so under the all hazards approach, where the responses that the Minister's spoken about tonight address the full range of contingencies that we face, both in terms of security and in terms of natural disasters. And I think the linkages that you weave there through those 5 sections of the speech have opened up important areas for us, which we'll be pursuing. I think it's been extremely well received tonight, and we very much appreciate the way in which you've addressed the issue. I'm delighted that through the college website, the wider access to this speech will be immeasurably increased in about 2 days or so people can access it there. And again, I'd like to thank you very much, Attorney, for coming, for the support you've given the college in our brief existence, and we look forward to welcoming you back at some stage in the future. I'd also like to thank all of you for coming out on a cold and damp night in Canberra to come to this second seminar. I think the fact that the numbers are as they are is a reflection both on the importance of the issue and the status of the speaker. So I thank you for coming and ask you to keep in touch with the website to see the agenda of activities that we'll be pursuing in this seminar series and in other ways. So thank you again for coming. It's been a tremendous night, and we've got you out the door pretty much on time, and we very much appreciate, Attorney, what you've given us. Thank you very much.